Thank you, Matt. Knew I could count on you. All right, you're going to make me nervous, but that's okay. Hi, good morning, everybody. Thank you for being here. There is a handout. It's kind of hidden under the Advent wreath back there. If you want one, you can grab it. We're going to be reading a lot of poetry today, so you'll want to follow along probably. Okay. I don't know. They heard I was teaching. That's good. Yeah, no, I don't blame them. All right. Thanks, Rich. You may have seen on the poster that the person for the Oxford movement and literature was coming soon. Well, that's me. I'm coming soon. If you don't know me, my name is Mark Clemens. I've been here for about 10 years, almost exactly 10 years. And I want to talk a little bit today about the shadow of the Oxford movement in literature. We've been marinating in the 19th century a lot for the last few weeks, or really for this whole series. I'm going to move us out of there. I've had enough of the Victorians. No, there's so much ground to cover. There are so many things that you can talk about. So with great apologies to the great poets of the Victorian Oxford movement, to John Keble, to Isaac Williams, to John Henry Newman, who, in addition to being a theologian, wrote poems and actually a couple novels. I've not read them. I don't know anyone who has read them. If you have, let me know what you think. And probably most especially apologies to Christina Rossetti, who is probably the finest poet to directly interact with the ideas of the Oxford movement. But I'm pushing them all out of the way today because I want to talk about Thomas Stearns Eliot, T.S. Eliot, and Wystan Hugh Auden, W.H. Auden, who show us a little bit of what became of Anglo-Catholicism in the 20th century after the carnage and the devastation of 2 world wars. What do we make of this, right? What happens to all of those nice doctrinal ideas after that? So before we dive into poems, I want to take a moment. I know that we're a pretty literary parish as far as that thing sort of goes, relatively speaking, and I maybe don't have to provide a defense of reading and writing poetry to this crowd. I'm going to do it anyway because I think it's worth every now and then articulating why do this, right? Why poetry? And more to the point, why difficult poetry? The gentlemen that we're going to be looking at this morning are difficult poets. It's not easy to understand what they're saying some of the time. I see eyes popping as I say that. And especially Auden and Eliot, when they come to write about theological ideas and wrestle with them, they tend to do it at great length, sometimes like book-length poems. I'm not going to burden you with any of that this morning, but that's the direction we're heading in, right? So, why difficult poetry? Why? I think of a lifetime ago, I was student teaching at Geneva High School down Roosevelt Road, and I was trying to work with a student who was struggling to understand a poem. I was sitting next to her, working through it together, and at one point, just exasperated very plaintively, she said, "Why don't people just say what they mean?" This is a good question, right? That's really the question. So, number one, well, we often don't know what we mean, right? That's one reason. Life is full of ambiguity and complexity. We often don't know the full meaning of things that happen to us until years down the road, if then, right? Our life keeps unfolding and it keeps changing the meaning of what has already happened to us. Can any of us say that we really have a testimony, a conversion narrative or something like that until we're dead? Because our life and our relationship to God is going to keep changing, right? So poetry can be a means of trying to compress all that into one space, right? Life has to be lived one day at a time, one moment at a time. But sometimes, especially in modernist poetry, like we're going to be looking at today, you try to compress all of that together. It's like taking all the notes in a melody on the piano and slamming them down all at once. So you're sounding all the notes in a gigantic chord. That's what some of these poets are doing. It's confusing, but life is confusing, and we have to pick through it slowly. Number two, and this is where I connect kind of most directly to the Oxford movement here, God doesn't always say what he means straight out either, right? This is important. And this is developed at length by Isaac Williams, one of the Oxford movement theologians, in tracts 80 and 87, where he talks about this principle of reserve. And what he means by reserve is like a reserved manner, like you keep things close to your chest, you don't reveal everything you're thinking right away. And he basically starts tract 80 by asking, why does it feel like when you read the Bible, like God is keeping a secret from us so often? God is hiding a lot of the big truths from us. We can look at the prophets, especially the messianic prophecies. It's not always easy to understand what's going on. Certainly for the Jews who received them at the time they were prophesied, the full meaning of that prophecy was not to be understood until hundreds of years later when Christ appears on the scene, right? And the gospel writers, in some places, helpfully explicate that for us. Jesus himself often keeps secrets. We see throughout the Gospels this concept of the messianic secret. He's constantly telling people not to tell anyone that he's healed them or not to tell them what they've seen, right? And then we also see this even after the Bible was written in the development of doctrine. Something like the Trinity, which we've come to understand was revealed in Scripture. That's not evident on the surface of things. We wouldn't have Jehovah's Witnesses if it were super clear that the Trinity was the plain doctrine, right? It took hundreds of years to work this out. So God is not always in the business of revealing every single thing he wants us to know immediately. It takes time, it takes thought, it takes argument to work out what's being said here. A couple other quick points from tract 80. The degree to which you get the revelation, to which you understand what's going on, has absolutely nothing to do with intellect. It has nothing to do with how smart you are. It has to do with how close to God you are. Thus, passages like Luke 10:21, you have hidden these things from the wise and understanding and revealed them to little children, right? And we must become like little children to enter the kingdom of God. Or elsewhere, this is again from tract 80, Williams points out, it might also be considered that holiness in man is, in fact, nothing else but a sense of the divine presence. To improve in holiness, therefore, is to grow in the consciousness of God's presence. That is, as we grow in holiness and righteousness and closeness to God, we are blessed to understand more of the plan, is how he puts it. I don't know that always feels true, and we'll get to that actually with Eliot, but that's at least the idea that's set out in the tracts. And yeah, finally, some things can only be revealed gradually. To draw on another poet, I think of Emily Dickinson, right? She says, "As lightning to the children eased, with explanation kind, the truth must dazzle gradually, or every man be blind," right? Sometimes some things. Oh, I'm sorry. As lightning to the children eased, with explanation kind, the truth must dazzle gradually, or every man be blind. Right?
Who wrote that?
Emily Dickinson.
Thank you. And
Yeah.
who wrote tract 80?
Isaac Williams.
Thank you.
80 and 87 are the ones where he talks about reserve. Yeah. Okay, and then finally, all right, so number one, we don't always know what we mean, hence the need to kind of work it out in difficult writing. Two, God doesn't always reveal what he means right away, so, why should we expect more of a mere mortal writing a poem? And like, I should say that also, like, reading the scriptures, being in church, participating in this tradition has already kind of gotten us into the hermeneutical mindset for approaching difficult poetry, right? Like, we're already thinking in that way. So this is doable, guys. We have an on-ramp. And then third, why difficult poetry? Because it's beautiful, right? I I doubt that any of us would walk into one of the great cathedrals of Europe and look at the intricate carving and the beautiful stained glass and the high vaulted ceilings and say, oh, why did they have to do that? Why couldn't they have just built a simple wall and a nice simple roof and been done with it, right? There were people who said that. They were called Puritans, and maybe we'll give them their due later on. They had a point, but right to the point, human labor and attention brought to the service of the Lord in the building of something intricate is a beautiful offering of worship, and I think we should accept it that way, even if it's not totally evident to us what they're doing in the moment. And that maybe a subpoint to this, it's fun. It's interesting. Fun in the way that like doing a crossword puzzle is fun, if you like doing that kind of thing. Again, like if our Philistine who can't appreciate the cathedral, were to look at a basketball game and say, how come they keep bouncing the ball? What is up with this dribbling? Like, don't they know it's easier to just run right to the hoop and throw it in? This rule's stupid. Well, no, that's not it at all. Introducing the complication is what makes the game work. It's what makes it fun and interesting to watch, right? And to participate in. So, bearing all those things in mind, if we look at your handout, I want to look at two poems that, following that principle of reserve, they conceal some key things. They're both, in a manner of speaking, Christmas poems, so kind of seasonally appropriate. You have to squint a little bit to see it, but it's there. And they're both on the problem of being in, but not of the world. It's maybe the best way I can summarize it. So, real quick, before we turn to the first poem on your handout. And by the way, on the back, I have this little for further reading section in deference to all those people I mentioned I wasn't going to talk about. If you're interested in anything I'm saying today, or if you would like to read some Victorians who are much easier to comprehend, here's some suggestions of where to go from here. And I've also included some novelists as well who are kind of working in the shadow of the Oxford movement. Anyway, so first poem here, Journey of the Magi by T.S. Eliot. Really quick biography. He's born in 1888 in the U.S. This is actually really easy to forget, but he's from St. Louis, but he was, basically uptight enough that he was able to successfully pass for British and spent most of his adult life in London. He's raised Unitarian, like many people in his generation. He kind of grew up questioning a lot of Victorian pieties, and this was really kicked into overdrive by World War I, right? Witnessing the just senseless devastation of that war, really, really caused him to question many of the pieties that he'd been taught. And in Eliot's case, that really left him with nowhere to go. He thought, well, if everything that I've received is not true and cannot make sense of this carnage, what do I have? And so he spends a lot of the 1920s grappling with that and just trying to figure out, well, what is there, right? In the wasteland, he says, these fragments have I shored against my ruin. That's kind of at that moment in his life, the only thing he's got is fragments to work with. You can't build much from that. And so in 1927, he converts to the Church of England, and actually, in fact, very specifically to Anglo-Catholicism. So he's definitely a follower of the Oxford movement. In some of his writings, he talks about the English Catholic Church, which is definitely a phrase that like only somebody steeped in the Oxford movement would use. This was kind of a shock to people who knew him when he converted. I'll share a quick line from Virginia Woolf, who wrote in a letter to somebody, "I have had a most shameful and distressing interview with poor dear Tom Eliot, who may be called dead to us all from this day forward. He has become an Anglo-Catholic and believes in God and immortality and goes to church. I was really shocked. I mean, there's something obscene in a living person sitting by the fire and believing in God, right? So this is his milieu, okay? And for Eliot, he entered the church. He saw the church really as a bulwark against what he felt was this encroaching and corrosive nihilism in himself. He didn't know what to believe in at this moment. And he saw the church as something that could really shore that up and give him more than fragments to work with, but a real enduring structure, something that can inject kind of meaning into his own life into the world around him and give him the ability to kind of endure the vicissitudes of the world. Peter Ackroyd, a biographer of Eliot, says principles were what his nature craved, and historic and ritualistic continuity. So that was really the key for him, is being able to see himself as part of this enduring structure that had lasted from Christ's institution of the church until now in an unbroken chain. And also he was specifically converting into the Church of England. It was the fact that the church in England was not just a religious institution, but a political one with the king at its head, and it served a social function. It kind of glued many aspects of society together. He thought that kind of holistic presence of the church in the country that he lived in was greatly to be desired. That was what he was looking for, was something that would tie every aspect of life together. And it's interesting to note, this is contra what the Oxford movement talks about, right? Where they kind of wanted to keep Parliament at arm's length away from the church, right? So I won't say he's in perfect lockstep with those guys. Eliot's interested in mystic Christianity. He draws a lot on Julian of Norwich in the Four Quartets cycle, which I'm not going to talk about. But when he pulls from things outside of Christianity, he's often pulling from Hindu and Buddhist spirituality. So he's very interested in the interior struggle. That's how he sees Christianity. His Christianity is very deeply internalized, right? And I think there's definitely a little bit of the sort of Buddhist idea that the goal is to purge yourself of the desire for worldly things and ascend. I think he saw that as being partially true, and saw that Christianity was the way to get there. So this poem that we're going to look at, Journey of the Magi, was written in the fall of 1927, so very shortly after he converted. This is the poem of a man who's has the baptismal water still, hasn't quite dried on his head, right? So I don't have a lot of time, but I'm going to read it anyway because it's a good poem. A cold coming we had of it. Just the worst time of the year for such a journey, and such a long journey. The ways deep and the weather sharp, the very dead of winter. And the camels galled, sore-footed, refractory, that means obstinate, lying down in the melting snow. There were times we regretted the summer palaces on slopes, the terraces and the silken girls bringing sherbet. Then the camel men cursing and grumbling and running away and wanting their liquor and women, and the night fires going out, and the lack of shelters, and the cities hostile, and the towns unfriendly, and the villages dirty and charging high prices. A hard time we had of it. At the end, we preferred to travel all night, sleeping in snatches with the voices singing in our ears, saying that this was all folly. Then, at dawn, we came down to a temperate valley, wet below the snow line, smelling of vegetation, with a running stream and a watermill beating the darkness, and 3 trees on the low sky, and an old white horse galloped away in the meadow. Then we came to a tavern with vine leaves over the lintel, 6 hands at an open door dicing for pieces of silver, and feet kicking the empty wineskins. But there was no information, so we continued, and arrived at evening, not a moment too soon finding the place. It was, you may say, satisfactory. All this was a long time ago, I remember, and I would do it again, but set down this. Were we led all that way for birth or death? There was a birth, certainly. We had evidence and no doubt. I had seen birth and death, but had thought they were different. This birth was hard and bitter agony for us, like death, our death. We returned to these places, these kingdoms, but no longer at ease here in the old dispensation, with an alien people clutching their gods. I should be glad of another death. Well, that's a real cheerful Christmas poem, right? I often think of that line near the end if I ever have to go to the mall at Christmas, an alien people clutching their gods. Okay. what we have here is a poem in 3 parts: the journey to something, the experience of it, and then the aftermath of that, the journey home. There's a lot of complaining in this poem. Why? Why is he doing that? Must the journey to Christ necessarily be so difficult, right? That's what we see in the first stanza. I think I'm going to really skip through this because I want to get to Auden as well. Yes, I think it's the short answer. Eliot really wants to emphasize what a gut-wrenching decision it is to encounter Christ, and what a radical break in your life it is. Right? The journey there is difficult, but if you notice in and by the way, those first 5 lines are taken verbatim from a sermon from Lancelot Andrewes. So Eliot is really steeped in the tradition of the church. But if you look in the 7th line, the camels are lying down in the melting snow. So even on the journey, there is already this breaking down, this warmth that's sneaking in. Right? We're moving towards the temperate valley of the second stanza. Okay, and then I just wanted to note that the last word of that first stanza, right? The voices in our ears saying this was all folly. Well, these are supposed to be wise men, right? There's an element of self-doubt there that I think Eliot probably resonated with. But then, I think we're also meant to start thinking about the foolishness of the world, or what looks like foolishness to the world is true wisdom, right? This is the heart of the gospel here. Okay. What? Yeah, that's right. Okay. Second stanza. Well, now we have something that seems redemptive, but this is very strange. We just have a lot of images juxtaposed on each other. They almost kind of remind me of like a tarot card pack. They're very stark and distinctive, but it's hard to know what they add up to. Right? What is the watermill? It's beating the darkness, which we can see is maybe kind of a pun. Beating meaning victorious in battle, right? So maybe this is an element of Christ here. He's acting to beat death. The 3 trees on the low sky, that's probably an image of Calvary, right? That seems pretty clear. There's three crosses. Okay. The tavern with vine leaves. I think everyone under his own vine and fig tree, right? This is the Messianic kingdom established. But in the tavern, there's people gambling for pieces of silver. That again brings us back to the cross and the soldiers, throwing lots for Jesus' clothes. The feet kicking the empty wineskins. What is this? Is it the old life, right? The old wineskins that you shouldn't pour new wine in, getting kicked out the door? There was no information in any of this. That's how he follows all of those images. So it almost undercuts the whole thing. I'm trying to figure out what these things mean, and then he tells us there's no information here. So I'm not really sure how to take that, to be honest. But we continued, right? None of that was any help to him to interpreting what was going on. We arrive at evening, finding the place. It was, you may say, satisfactory. That is all he has to say about the Magi's encounter with the Christ child, right? This is understatement, to say the least. And by the way, I think if it weren't for the title of this poem, I doubt we'd have any idea what was going on here. That is Eliot being generous with us and giving us a clue to what's going on. But that word, satisfactory, I think because there is no image of the nativity, there's no picture painted, it's just a feeling that we're left with. That word is, and he sets it off with putting that little parenthetical phrase before it, so that satisfactory kind of hangs out on the end of the line by itself. We might think about satisfaction in a salvific sense, in the economy of salvation, right? We might think about Article 31 of the 39 Articles, right? The offering of Christ once made is that perfect redemption, propitiation, and satisfaction for the sins of the whole world, right? That's a deliberate line being drawn here. There's no accidents in this kind of poetry, right? If you think you see a coincidence, it's probably there on purpose, and you should follow it. Okay. So we have this understatement, but if you're standing on, say, the shore of Lake Michigan, and it's a foggy day, you're looking out at the lake, right? And a giant wave comes in towards the shore and back out, much bigger than any waves you've seen before. You think, what's going on? And you have to imagine that it's the wake of some big ship way out there. You can't see the ship, but you see the effect that it's made. That's what's going on here in the last stanza, right? Eliot is not going to give us the satisfaction, the aesthetic satisfaction of seeing the nativity scene, of seeing a conversion. He just reveals what happens afterwards, right? And what happens afterwards? What kind of change has happened to the Magus here? He still seems miserable, right? He's questioning everything. Were we led all that way for birth or death? He doesn't understand what he's seen. And there's a couple things going on here. I think that Eliot, in part, is expressing his own anxieties, like the anxiety maybe shortly after a conversion of wondering, have I done the right thing? Have I made a huge mistake? Does this really make sense? But I think he's also throwing that out there and putting that viewpoint down in order to work against it, right? We see kind of the disappointment of this that's expressed. What happened? What it means is that you can't go back to the old world once you've seen Jesus. You try as you might, you won't feel at home there. And I think that's where the joy of Christmas is hidden in this poem, is inside of that disappointment. I'm just going to let you meditate on that because I want to move on. But that's I think all I have to say about this. Okay, W.H. Auden. Now a much, much longer poem. I'm definitely not going to have time to get through all this, but I will do my best. We'll get as far as I can and try to make some gestures, and you can read it yourself later on. Okay, Auden is born in 1907. He is fully a 20th century man. He's a real prodigy in the poetry scene, right? He appears on the scene in his full powers seem to already be available. He publishes his first book in 1930 when he's 23. By 1933, people are already using the word Audenesque to describe things. They're talking about the Auden generation, right? This kid could write, okay? And he made it, yeah, everybody wanted to write like him, except Auden, it seems. He started to get sick of himself. And so then you find this through his whole career. He's always shifting his approach. He's always changing his mind. He's always revising his old poems, and in some cases repudiating them. Some of his most popular poems, he didn't want to be published in his final collected edition because he thought they weren't true, and therefore he shouldn't subject people to them. Right? He saw that he was gifted as a poet and that he could do powerful things with words, and he could put ideas in people's heads, and he became very uncomfortable with that idea, that he had that kind of power, and so started trying to work against it. Even before he became a Christian, he was already starting to work against that kind of thing. And one of the things he did to do that is kind of made the opposite move of Eliot. Instead of being an American living in England, he's born in England, goes to Oxford, moves to America in 1939 on the eve of World War II. This did not earn him a lot of friends back home in Britain. People were held a grudge against him until he died, basically, that he had abandoned his country in its hour of need. Over 1939, 1940, shortly after he gets here, he starts converting. He starts going to, he's in America, so he's going to Episcopal churches. And in part because of the war, because he realized that what we'd now, I guess, call secular humanism, the sort of ideas that were being thrown around in his environment, he felt that they did not provide any definitive explanation for why Hitler was evil, right? He did not see anything that could fully explain his own revulsion to what he was seeing in Europe. But he saw that in the church. When he converts, he's very much under the influence of Kierkegaard, so not totally an Oxford movement guy here. And like Eliot, he's very interested in that kind of internal struggle that Kierkegaard talks about. He's also influenced by living theologians on the continent, so Paul Tillich, Reinhold Niebuhr, Karl Barth, Dietrich Bonhoeffer. These are all people that Auden's reading at the time and interacting with, and in some cases becomes friends with them. This poem that I've picked here is called Homage to Cleo, and that's written in 1955, so it's not an immediate conversion poem like the Eliot poem that we just looked at. He's been a Christian for about 15 years and had time to think about things. So that's not what's going on here. But his Christianity had changed a lot by this point. He'd come to repudiate some of Kierkegaard's ideas. And at this moment in his life and in his work, he's really wrestling with this idea that as human beings created in the image of God, we live in two worlds. And the way he conceptualized those worlds is nature and history. And nature meaning we are animals and we have to obey certain natural laws, and we have bodies that we're kind of stuck with for better or for worse that sometimes do disgusting things, right? But we are also, and we have instincts that sometimes we follow, but we are also rational creatures made in the image of God, given a soul, and we are able to conceptualize the fact that we live in time and that we have the ability to choose what we do with our lives. We can, our actions, predestination theology aside, Auden very much is a believer in free will, that we can choose what we want to do. Right? We're not animals behaving simply on instincts that are based around the cycle of the seasons or something like that, right? Like, no, we wake up every day and decide what we're going to do that day. So we have one foot in each of these camps, and it's kind of a terrifying thing for Auden, right? We have the freedom to choose what we're going to do, and which means that we can't undo those things once they're done, right? We have to live by the consequences of them. And so therefore we enter into the world of accountability and responsibility. Yes. So we have these two worlds, nature, which is cyclical, instinctive, and given, let's say, right? God has designed it one way, and that's what you get. And there's a world of history, which is linear. It's conscious, right? We take conscious actions and we choose them. So this poem that I picked, Homage to Cleo, is sort of about those two worlds, and he's going to emphasize the world of history a lot more. He kind of comes down on why it's a good thing that we have to live in history and take responsibility for our actions in here. Elsewhere, he'll play the other side of the fence and talk up nature a little bit, and kind of rejoice in the fact that we have bodies that keep us humble, basically. But we'll talk about that later. Okay. Yeah, so Cleo is one of the 9 muses, and she's specifically the muse of history, right? So that's one clue we have to interpreting this poem. And a second clue is not in the poem itself, but it comes from a letter. Auden sent an early copy of this poem to J.R.R. Tolkien, who he was a big fan of, and he noted, you will see this is a hymn to Our Lady. So really, Cleo is Mary, and we should kind of be looking for some of that evidence. I should just footnote really quickly my immense debt to our former catechist here, Alan Jacobs. Pretty much everything I know about Auden I've taken from his writing and teaching. I was privileged to take an Auden course with him when I was at Wheaton, and really kind of was a life-changing thing. And what I didn't learn from him, I learned from the late Roger Lundeen. So I'm really kind of standing on the shoulders of giants here. But all that to say, none of this came out of my own head, is what I'm trying to say. Right? Okay. So rather than try to read this whole poem and walk through it, I'll just kind of give you the basic movements here, and I'll go until the verger shows up there to kick me out. What we open, the first kind of movement of this poem is a description of the realm of nature and the creatures who live there, the animals. In the first stanza, there's a lot of strangely martial, militant, violent image, right? There's submission and duel and combat. Nature is kind of underwritten by violence. And he, as I was just saying earlier, right, he emphasizes the fact that the creatures that live in nature don't have any choice about what they're going to do. They operate by instinct. In the end of the second stanza, right, he talks about birds who chirp not for effect, but because chirping is the thing to do. That's all they know how to do. Right? So he enters the scene himself. He's reading a book, and he kind of marvels on how he doesn't understand what the animals around him are doing, and they don't understand what he's doing. They just see a patch of unsatisfactory smell, and to observation, his book is dead. He's looking at something that nature does not comprehend, right? So he's already depicting himself with kind of a foot in each of these camps. Okay. Then he starts talking about Aphrodite and Artemis, the pagan gods and goddesses who rule the world of nature. They, like the Greek gods, are really just kind of our own instincts magnified and given great power, right? They're lust and war and death and the growing cycle, right? They're natural instincts kind of given great power, like I said. And he's going to contrast those with Clio, with Mary. Okay. 4 minutes, okay. So he says, we are not animals. Right? We are brought face to face, Clio, with your silence. After that, nothing is easy. It kind of reminds us of Eliot, right? I would be glad of another death. But then he goes on to say, well, maybe that's not such a bad thing, right? Woken at sunup to hear a cock pronouncing himself, though all his sons had been castrated and eaten. I was glad I could be unhappy, right? In the pagan world of nature, there's no reason to find anything wrong with the natural state of things, with all the violence that underwrites nature. And there is no comfort to be offered us either. And nobody's going to do anything to change that, okay? All right, and there's almost something tragic about that. So why are we glad to be unhappy? Because we have the opportunity to do something different, right? Okay, he goes on, if we flip the page, or turn the page, right, to visit the grave of the friend, to make an ugly scene. I want to note that that's a little paraphrase of John 11, of Jesus weeping at Lazarus' grave, right? As though no one dies in particular. The worth of each individual human being can only be seen when we look at them through the lens of history, as particular people in a particular time and place. For Auden, there's no difference between one rabbit and another. They're just animals. But people are of infinite difference, and that is where their value lies, he says. Okay. If it were, right, if we were all alike, forgiveness would be no use. That's a really key line, and I'll come back to that. Okay. So where he's going with all of this is, so I want to say, he uses the word silence 7 times at least in this poem by my counting. And it's always associated with Clio, with this figure of Mary. Why is she silent? What is going on there? The world of history is silent because we are not compelled to do anything. We speak into that silence. And so Mary's silence is merciful. He calls it at one point, who's merciful silence, because it doesn't judge us for that, right? But that silence is terrifying as well. It creates the responsibility to act, not just obey our instincts, which means that therefore we can sin and our choices can't be undone, and that's terrifying. What that means is that we create the need, what that allows for is the need for forgiveness and grace. Forgiveness that is not compelled on us, but chosen, that we can choose to accept as well. That's why this poem is a hymn to Mary, the mother of Christ, who presides over the world's moments of ultimate and never to be repeated significance, right? He has a passage where he describes how Mary appears in art, and he references the nativity and the deposition, the taking down of Jesus from the cross. Those are moments that only happened once, and that have significance. Auden doesn't have a lot of patience for mythical interpretations of Christianity that suggest like, oh, this is just one kind of narrative of a God who dies, that recur through history. No, he says, no, it matters because this is real, and these were real people. And so, right, Mary is the one through whom God enters the world of history, and so that's why this is her poem. And that's why I say this is a Christmas poem, because if you squint at it a little bit, you see that it's really about the consequences of the incarnation for us. What else? Well, I'll just look at the last stanza because it's a really wonderful example of the kind of self-deprecation that Auden was constantly pulling, right? He's very skeptical of the idea that poets can change things, that poetry matters in any meaningful way, right? So he says, approachable as you, as Mary, seem, I dare not ask if you bless the poets, for you do not look as if you ever read them, nor can I see a reason why you should, right? Before God, we have nothing to bring. We just have to be ourselves. None of our works are going to impress him. Okay, that's all I got. Thanks, everybody. Thanks, Mary.